Good day everyone, I'm Hayat Makalipay Kulanag and today I will be discussing one of the important topics in Ed401, Field Study 1, which is Learners' Behavior and Motivation, Understanding Learners' Needs. This topic is important because as future teachers, we will encounter learners who behave and respond differently in the classroom. Some students may be active and participative, while others may be quiet or appear uninterested. Our responsibility is not simply to observe the behavior, but to understand what may be causing it and what the learners need. Now, at the end of this presentation, we are expected to understand several important concepts. First, we will define learner behavior and motivation. Second, we will identify the factors that influence how learners behave and participate in class. We will also differentiate intrinsic and intrinsic motivation. And most importantly, we will understand why teachers need to consider the individual needs of learners when planning instruction and responding to classroom behavior. Teaching is not simply the process of delivering information to students. An active teacher must also understand who the learners are and how they behave, what motivates them, and what they need in order to learn effectively. Learners have different backgrounds, personalities, learning preferences, and levels of confidence. Because of these differences, learners may respond differently to the same classroom situation. Teaching is not only about delivering information. A teacher also needs to understand learners who are receiving that information. Every learner is different. They have different experiences, interests, abilities, personalities, level of confidence, and motivation. Because of these differences, the same classroom activity may produce different reactions. One student may become very active, while another may remain quiet. This does not automatically mean that the quiet student is lazy or uninterested. There may be other factors affecting the learner. Therefore, effective teachers should look beyond the behavior and ask, what might this learner need? What is learner behavior? Learner behavior refers to the observable ways students act, respond, participate, communicate, and interact during the learner process. For example, we can observe students answering questions, asking for help, completing activities, working with classmates, or participating in discussions. We can also observe behaviors such as remaining silent, avoiding activities, becoming distracted, or showing frustration. However, an important point is that behavior is only what we see. It does not always tell us the reason behind the behavior. This brings us to the importance of looking beyond observable behavior. For example, if a student is quiet, we should not immediately conclude that the student does not know the answer. The student might be, shy, anxious, afraid of making mistakes, or simply more comfortable expressing ideas through writing, right? Similarly, if a student does not submit an assignment, there could be different reasons. The learner may not be, or that learner may not have understood their instructions, may be experiencing difficulty with the task, or may lack of motivation. So instead of asking only, what is wrong with these learners? Teachers should ask, what might be influencing this behavior? And what does this learner need? Now that we understand the learner behavior can have a different causes, let us talk about learner needs. Learners have different needs that can affect how they behave and participate in class. These needs can be academic, emotional, social, motivational, and related to their confidence. For example, academically, a learner may need clearer instructions or additional practice. Emotionally, a learner may need feel safe, respected, and supported. Socially, the learner may need to feel accepted by the classmates. So as a future teachers, we need to recognize these needs because when learners' needs are addressed, they are more likely to participate and engage in learning. Now, what is motivation? Motivation refers to the factors that influence a learner's willingness to begin, participate in, and continue an activity. In the classroom, motivation can influence how much an effort learners give, how attentive they are, whether they participate, and whether they continue working even when an activity becomes difficult. For example, imagine a student who finds mathematics difficult. If the student is motivated, they may continue practicing even after making mistakes. But if the student has a little motivation, they may immediately give up. So this shows that motivation plays an important role in learning. There are two types of motivation. The first type is intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation comes from within the learner. A learner participates in an activity because they find it interesting, enjoyable, meaningful, or personally satisfying. For example, a student may read a book because they genuinely enjoy reading. Another students may practice drawing because they enjoy improving their skills. A student may solve a mathematics problem simply because they enjoy the challenge. So, an easy way to remember intrinsic motivation is, I want to do it because I enjoy it or I find it meaningful. The motivation comes from the learner's own interest or satisfaction. On the other hand, intrinsic motivation is influenced by external factors. For example, a student may study because they want to get a high grade. Another, students may complete an assignment because the teacher promised additional points. And on the other hand, a learner may participate because they want recognition or a reward. In some cases, learners may also behave appropriately because they want to avoid a negative consequences. So we can remember intrinsic motivation as, I do it because of an external outcome or consequences. This means that the reason for participating comes from something outside the learner. Now let us compare intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. When we compare the two, intrinsic motivation comes from the internal interest, enjoyment, curiosity, or personal satisfaction. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is influenced by external factors such as grades, rewards, recognitions, or consequences. For example, if I study because I enjoy learning about the topic, that is intrinsic motivation. But if I study because I want to get a high grade, that is intrinsic motivation. So, it is important to remember that we should not simply say that intrinsic motivation is good and extrinsic motivation is bad. External rewards can sometimes encourage learners to participate. However, teachers should also help learners develop personal interests and meaningful reasons for learning. Alright, so one theory that helps us understand motivation more deeply is self-determination theory. When we talk about self-determination theory, this helps explain the conditions that support motivation. So the theory identifies three important psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So these three concepts are very useful for teachers because they help us understand what learners may need in order to become more motivated and engaged. In simple terms, autonomy means I have a choice. Competence means I can do it. Relatedness means I belong here. And alright, so let us discuss each of these three needs. Alright. So the first psychological needs is autonomy. Autonomy is having a sense of choice, ownership, and meaningful participation in what we are doing. In the classroom, teachers can support autonomy by giving learners appropriate choices. For example, instead of requiring everyone to use exactly the same topic for a project, the teacher can provide several topics and allow the students to choose one that interests them. Another example is allowing students to choose how they will present their learning, such as through a poster, presentation, with an output, or another appropriate format. However, autonomy does not mean that students can do whatever they want. The teacher still provides clear objectives and expectation. The important point is that learners have some meaningful control over their learning. So the second psychological needs are competence. Competence refers to a learner's feeling that they are capable of accomplishing a task and developing their skills. Alright, so think about a student says, I can do it. I can do this if I practice. So that learner has a sense of competence. By giving a clear instruction, providing appropriate challenges, allowing students to practice, and giving a constructive feedback. For example, instead of telling a student, your answer is wrong, the teacher could say, you have the correct first step. Yes, you have the correct first step. Let us look at the next part together. So this type of feedback helps students recognize that they are making progress, not that mistakes are, part of the learning. So the third psychological needs are relatedness. So relatedness refers to a learner's feeling of connection, belonging, and acceptance. Students needs to feel that they are respected and that they are part of the classroom community. Teachers can support relatedness by building respectful relationship, listening to students, encouraging cooperation, and creating exclusive activities. For example, when students feel accepted by their classmates, so they became more comfortable participating in group discussion. So, as a future teachers, we should remember that learning does not happen only through academic activities. Relationship and the classroom environment are also influence how learners experience in school. At this point, we can use a simple process while responding to a learner behavior. Observe, understand, and respond. First, observe. What exactly the learner is doing? When does the behavior happen? Or how often does it happen? Second, understand. Why it might be influencing the behavior? Or does the learner understand the task? Or is the learner interested? Or does the learner feel confident or safe? Third is respond. Based on what we understand, what strategy can we use to support the learner? We can also monitor what happens after our intervention. So, did the strategy help? This process reminds us that effective teachers do not simply, react to behavior. They first try to understand it. Aside from the three psychological needs, there are several factors can also influence learner motivation. The first is interest. Learners may participate more when the topic connects with something they care about. The second is relevance. Students are more likely to value a lessons when they understand how it applies to real life. The third is confidence. Yes, it is important. Learners are more willing to attempt difficult tasks when they believe they can make the progress. Another factor is feedback. Students need to know what they did well and what they can improve. So, and also the classroom environment is important. So, a classroom environment or a classroom should be respectful, safe, supportive, and inclusive. And finally, relationship with teachers and classmates, because relationship with teachers and classmates can influence motivation and participation. So another important concept is individual differences. Learners are not exactly the same, right? So they differ in their prior knowledge, abilities, interests, personalities, experiences, confidence, learning pace, and motivation. Because of these differences, one strategy may work very well for a learner, but not for another. For example, one student may enjoy answering questions in front of the class, while another student may be more comfortable writing their answer first and then discussing it with a partner. So this is why teachers should provide different opportunities of participation. Understanding individual differences does not mean lowering expectation. Instead, it means finding appropriate ways to help different learners reach their learning objectives. At this point, we can use a simple process while responding to a learner behavior. Observe, understand, and respond. First, observe. What exactly the learner is doing? When does the behavior happen? Or how often does it happen? Second, understand. What might be influencing the behavior? Or does the learner understand the task? Or is the learner interested? Or does the learner feel confident or safe? Third is respond. Based on what we understand, what strategy can we use to support the learner? We can also monitor what happens after our intervention. So, did the strategy help? This process reminds us that effective teachers do not simply, react to behavior. They first try to understand it. So now, before we end our discussion, let us remember the major ideas from this lesson. First, learners are different. They have different experiences, abilities, interests, and needs. Second, behavior. Behavior has context. What we see does not always tell us why a learner behaves in a particular way. Third, motivation influence learning. It affects participation, efforts, persistence, and engagement. Fourth, learners have important psychological needs, particularly autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And finally, effective teachers should seek to understand before responding. So the key process we can remember is observe, understand, and respond. To conclude, understanding learner behavior and motivation is an important responsibility of every future teacher. A quiet learner is not necessarily uninterested. A student who does not submit work is not necessarily lazy. A learner who makes mistakes is not necessarily incapable. There may be academic, emotional, social, and motivational factors beyond what we observe. Therefore, third teachers should look beyond the behavior and ask, what does this learner need in order to learn? So when teachers understand learners' needs, provide meaningful support, build confidence, and create a sense of belonging, learners are more likely to become engaged and motivated. Ultimately, effective teaching is not only about asking what should I teach, but also asking who are you, my learners, and how can I help them to learn? So that concludes my presentation about learners' behavior and motivation, understanding learners' needs. I hope that this discussion helped us understand that as future teachers, we should not only teach learners but also take time to understand them. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.